You may be wondering why I'm reviewing a book. Well, it's actually a poem that's over 2,000 years old. Let me explain. There's a guy I follow on the internet, and his name is John Hinderaker. A couple of years ago, I read an article he wrote with a list of the books he had read that year. Now, he mentioned this translation of the Aeneid among those books, and he said he liked it a lot. Now, in the past, I've found that his judgment is really solid, so I decided to give this thing a try. Now, also, I first came across the Aeneid when I was in high school. I was studying Latin, and the Aeneid was the text in my senior year. It was absolutely torture. It certainly killed any interest I might have had for the study of Latin, as well as Latin literature. So even though I respect John Hinderaker's judgment on this kind of stuff, I picked this translation up with a little bit of trepidation. Gotta say, I was pleasantly surprised. Let me tell you about this book, and I'm going to start off with the introduction. Now, usually I find these things to be pretty tedious, boring. This one is not. It's absolutely excellent. The translator of this poem, the Aeneid, is a man named Robert Fagles. He starts his introduction with a fairly brief summary of his background, and it turns out he was a captain in the United States Army fighting in Italy during World War II. Okay, that absolutely perked my interest. Then in the introduction, he gives a very concise summary of the poem, and he puts it in a context that sort of makes it understandable. And then he goes on to outline the history of the poem during the 2,000 years since it was written. You know, what comes through loud and clear is that for that entire period, it's been regarded as a classic in ancient literature. Now let's take a look at the story itself. If you've never heard of Aeneas, the central character, he was a warrior who was fighting on the Trojan side during the 10-year Trojan War. He escaped the destruction of the city and went on to be part of the legend concerning the invention of Rome. Now, in some ways and in some parts, the story of his journey from Troy to Italy is very similar to the adventures of Ulysses in Homer's poem, the Odyssey. Similar, but pretty different. For example, where Ulysses was pretty much a wily schemer, Aeneas is kind of the Dudley Do-Right of ancient heroes. He's a great fighter, he's super brave, he's terrifically patriotic. And the other big difference from the Odyssey is that the journey from Troy to Rome is only part of the story. Where, you know, the Odyssey, that was the whole story. The story of this trip is pretty exciting. Exciting, but it's also as fantastic as anything you're likely to see in Star Wars. And you really have to admire Virgil's imagination. And of course, Virgil is the guy who wrote the original poem in Latin. But that journey is only part of the story. The other part has to do with founding Rome. Now, there are a lot of gods and goddesses who play a part in the story. Some of the names I recognize, but not all of them. And to be honest, I spent no more time worrying about who they were than I spent worrying where Jabba the Hutt came from. So for me, that didn't get in the way of the story. Now, another thing I didn't really pay any attention to was poetry. The original Latin version of the story, it was in some kind of poetry. And Robert Fagles, in his translation, divides the text up into verses. But I don't know whether he produced poetry or not. I don't know enough about it. And as a matter of fact, what I did, I just disregarded that and I read it like it was a regular book. And for me, that seemed to work fine. Now, another interesting little side note, the book has a fair amount of political propaganda, all aimed at inflating the reputation of Caesar Augustus. A little hard to imagine ancient spin, isn't it? But there is that, and it seems to have paid off for Virgil. Another thing is that reading this book is like eating a Napoleon. It's a little bit too rich to take in a single sitting, and I ended up picking the book up, putting it down for a few days, picking it up again, and I found that worked. Now, do I recommend it? Yes, but it's certainly not for everybody. If you have an interest in ancient literature or in Roman history, or you simply want to catch up on stuff you might have been assigned to read in school but didn't really do, you might consider taking this thing up. And that's Robert Fagles' translation of the Aeneid. I'm going to see you next week.